Okay, this lesson is going to go over recognition of waveforms and troubleshooting. I'm going to assume you all have the basics down. If not, some things you're going to want to make sure you can do is identify the mode of ventilation the patient is in when at the bedside and looking at your waveforms on the screen. For your pressure time waves, you should be able to identify the volume ventilation curve compared to the pressure ventilation curve. With your flow time waves, you should remember and recognize that volume ventilation has the square waveform, whereas pressure ventilation should be more like a triangle. Oops. Now, one thing with your pressure ventilation and your flow time, a trick that I have finally committed to memory, it took me a long time, is the slower this rises to peak in your pressure ventilation, okay, the longer it takes to get to that peak, that means the patient is sucking, like really trying to suck in that air. So they're working harder to breathe. The more straight up and down this line is, okay, if it shoots right up, that means they're getting a breath easy on inhalation and then allowed to exhale. So that's one thing you should be able to recognize. Some adjustments you can make to flow. This depends on your ventilator, but you should be able to change your I time. Okay, here we have a 0.8 second I time. So your inspiratory time, if you would measure from here to here, should be double your expiratory time from there to there. Okay, so you have a 1 to 2 ratio, an IE of 1 to 2. Okay. The other adjustment you can make is your flow cycle percent. Now what this is this allows the patient to exhale after 90% of the breath has been delivered. So it allows them to dump the last 10%. Now we can see that in this picture because on inspiration, the patient takes their breath in. Oops, try that again. Take their breath in and, oh, for Pete's sakes, they should end their inspiration by coming back to the baseline. And here you can see by the arrow, they actually are going into exhalation before they are back to baseline. So this example here is showing that after 90% of this patient's breath is delivered, okay, it's not returning to baseline before they go into exhalation. It's stopping right here. So 10% of that person's inspiratory time was dumped. So you could say you have an inspiratory time of 0.8 seconds over here. If you had a 10% flow cycle time, then the breath would have ended more like right here. Okay, and that would have went into expiration right there. Okay, let's go on. Okay, this is an example of your patient being in pressure control mode, and notice the yellow arrows are identifying that on the inspiratory limb of each breath, it is red. Now for this ventilator graphic, red means that it is a mandatory delivered breath, meaning the patient is not initiating a breath at all. So this is a pressure control where the patient is not initiating the breath. Now remember, for our babies, we don't want to assume total control for them unless they're recovering from a surgical procedure. But when we're dealing with our newborns and respiratory distress syndrome, fetal asphyxia, we want them to start taking their own spontaneous breath, and we just want the vent to support them. Again, so pressure control, the only time we want the vent to deliver all mandatory breaths with no patient initiation would be maybe after surgery when we really do want the patient to rest. Here's an example of pressure control waveforms. And again, notice my yellow arrows are showing these are all the patient is initiating the breath and then the ventilator is delivering the set pressure. This is an example of pressure SIMV, and you'll notice I have waves with the green arrow and then waves with the orange arrow. Well, remember in pressure SIMD, the patient can still initiate their own breath, and if it is one of the set rate breath, it's going to get full support at the vent. Okay, so that's what this green arrowed breath right here is. Okay, the patient initiated the breath and then the ventilator fully supported it. Over here by my orange arrows, okay, notice these waves are so much shorter than the others. Okay, these are all pressure support breaths. So the patient initiated the breath, and if you have no pressure support setting in, then they're only breathing their level of PEEP. Now, if you set your pressure support, then it might be a little higher. There is no reason to set your pressure support so that their pressure support breath is equal to their pressure delivered breath or their mandatory breath. There's no reason for that. Okay, here's a quiz question, quick review. What mode do you see below? And what is triggering each breath? Okay, that was a little bit of a trick because this is pressure control SIMD without the patient initiating any of their breaths. So remember, pressure control SIMD, if the patient is not initiating any breath and does not have any additional spontaneous breath, then it looks exactly like pressure control. So for you to make an assessment, you usually need to have your mode and settings available to you. These graphics here are for pressure regulated volume control. And in this example, we have the tidal volume set at 300. So the ventilator is delivering pressure to try to maintain that 300 tidal volume. So you see, to start off here, moving from the right to the left, you see lower pressure here, it's right at about 20, and you see it rises up to about, I don't know, 35-ish, 40. So here the PIP is slowly increasing in an attempt to maintain the tidal volume as the compliance is decreasing. Over here on the further to the left, you see the PIP is decreasing to maintain the tidal volume with an increase in compliance. So here we started at a pressure of 35 or 40, and then it drops down to like 20. Interesting, if you look at your flow waveforms and you compare this one here, you see inspiration starts and pretty much ends right on the baseline, and you don't see excessive time here, but compare that to this little guy here. Okay, here the inspiration starts at baseline, and then inspiration is continuing. Look at that, it's continuing even longer after it's returned to baseline. Okay, so what's causing that? Well, the inspiratory time is just too long. The patient isn't being allowed to exhale when they want there. But then you notice as the PIP starts to decrease, you notice the flow waveform starts to normalize again and the I time seems more normal.